All right. Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast, and we are continuing our Overthrowing the Network State series while we are here in person at Zuzalu. I'm here with Primavera, and our guest is Ameen Soleimani. And yeah, you're like, I guess, like an integral person when it comes to like reading about the history of Ethereum. So we thought it'd be interesting to talk to you about kind of like the development of the technology and to think about how and why it became more relevant to talk about the types of things that are talked about in the network state now than it was in the past. So we're interested in like digging into that history and like some of the technical work that maybe you've been doing, and maybe we can touch upon on some of the activist stuff that you've been doing as well.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
To start, would you like to give an introduction to yourself for those who don't know you and like all the different projects you're part of?
Yeah, sure. I got into crypto buying mushrooms like a couple people in 2012 back in the day. At some point I worked for Consensus. I went on to start SpankChain, which is like a crypto porn payments platform. Then I started Molok DAO, which was like one of the first grants DAOs on Ethereum. It paved the way for getting rid of PTS DAO after the DAO hack, and helped help people realize the coordination potential that was about to be unlocked. I've also was helping give a bunch of the grants to Tornado Cash. I'm more recently working on a fork of Tornado Cash called Privacy Pools. I also built a fork of MakerDAO's DAI, which is called Rye. It's sort of like the ETH maximalist version, where it's only backed by ETH collateral. And recently, my main focus has been trying to help Iran through some nonprofit work through my NGO DAO called Iran Unchained, giving grants legally and compliantly through some OFAC exemptions to Iranians who are trying to advance, humanitarian aid, network infrastructure, and pro-democracy efforts.
Nice. So I think maybe the first place to start that I think would be interesting to talk about is maybe Molok DAO. Do you want to describe, I guess, what was the context at that time when it was started and like what it eventually became? If I understand correctly, it came out of, I guess maybe like a couple of years or a year after the DAO hack. So everyone, I think when Ethereum came out, everyone's like super starry-eyed, like, yeah, let's do DAOs, everything automated, it'll be totally fine. And then it totally was not fine. And so people stayed away from DAOs. Technology kind of improved a lot over time. And then eventually, I think it was during a hackathon that you guys came up with Molok DAO, which became a more, I guess, kind of the first standard for DAOs and how to manage treasuries together.
Yeah, so my first week at Consensus was the DAO hack. It was pretty fun. Yeah, we were exactly starry-eyed. We're like, DAOs are the future. Everything is going to be DAO. And then it got hacked. $150 million was in jeopardy. And then Ethereum had to roll back and sort of. It was the first and only time Ethereum has ever revoked the charter of a DAO. Is like how I like to frame that. Most time you don't really have to worry about that kind of thing, and it doesn't seem like that's likely in the future. But in the aftermath of that, I think it was Griff Green. He came up with this term called PTS DAO, where everybody that you wanted to talk to DAOs about that was previously excited sort of went cold, and they were like, "You don't want to do this. Didn't you see what happened last time? It blew up. Everybody lost their money. Like, are you crazy?" And we're like, yes, we see the like untapped, coordination potential right on the other side of this hill. Like, we have to get there because we knew that. When I say we, I mean like me and a few of my like coordination junkie friends. There's people like James Young, Arjun, Connects people, Clubland. Now, we're all just working, nights and weekends to try and make Molok DAO happen. We realized that the way to get rid of PTS DAO and help advance, DAOs in general was to just try and make the simplest possible DAO, like the minimum viable DAO. And so we decided to just make a DAO as like 400 lines of code. You could raise money in shares. You could mint new shares to essentially allocate some fraction of the pooled ether to recipients, grantees, and everybody can sort of vote on who should get the funds and whether or not new members should be admitted. And there was also a rage quit function, which was one of I think the first time minority protections was like encoded into the DAO contracts themselves. And the rage quit was a mechanism to allow people to permissionlessly exit the DAO with their proportional share of the existing funds. And so it became easy to recruit. I walked around at ETH Denver 2019 when we launched it, and we were like, hey, do you want to help save Ethereum? Deposit 100 ETH into Molok DAO. And they're like, how do I exit if we want to? And we're like, whenever you want, just push this button and you get your money back. And they're like, okay, that sounds great. So we were able to raise, over 2,500 ETH from 25 individual contributors. And we started giving grants to advance Ethereum 2 and other sort of Ethereum open source efforts. It was the bottom of the bear market. So ETH was like $100. So this was like a 10 grand buy-in. And from there, we were able to recruit like Vitalik, the Ethereum Foundation Consensus Joe Lubin to help fill in the treasury and provide some additional support. And then it became like even more powerful and started giving out even more grants.
I think it's interesting to me. I think, the rage quit function, I'm like surprised that it wasn't thought of before. Mm-hmm. I guess now it just feels very obvious that that's an option. Yeah. Or that could have been an option for people.
I was as surprised as you were. I didn't want to actually build Molok DAO myself. I wanted to use the Aragon contracts, but they disagreed that the rage quit was an important piece of mechanism to have.
They didn't want it,
and they didn't think it was important at the time.
Okay.
And since then, they have sometimes you just have to prove things.
Right.
So since then, they've incorporated it into their framework. But for me, in my squad of like part-time devs who were like not trying to build a DAO platform. We were just trying to build one DAO for ourselves. It was like too much work to fork Aragon and add it. So
right.
It was actually simpler to just do it ourselves.
Yeah, fair. To me, it kind of represents a major milestone in like thinking of governance when it comes to Ethereum world and smart contracts. That I think, because I think in the beginning, I think for me especially as well, I was like very maybe like naive in the beginning. I was like, oh, we can make like all these like democratic structures through smart contracts, and it'll be like we can do that. And then it just came with a lot of failed experiments, and then I think now we're at a point where it's becoming a lot more interesting and a lot more. I guess things can become more complex, but it started surprisingly with just like being able to pull out your funds.
Yep.
Even though like it's not something that maybe like I'm personally also maybe like not interested in like that type of structure, but it's also just like a very basic thing to be able to have that option to do in like these types of experiments.
And so if we try to focus on how those new technology, blockchain, DAOs, etc., can support the activity of network states in whatever flavors we can think of. To which extent, like from a more maybe like abstract layer, like to which extent do you think that blockchain technologies are enabling things enabling entities or collectives to actually operate in a much more self-sovereign manner without depending on existing corporations, servers, or like, in fact, server controlled by nation states. So like, to which extent do you think that blockchain technology really provide this type of self-sovereign infrastructure? And if it does, what are the various bricks or building blocks of the tech stack that are necessary in order to have a full-fledged network state?
I think that's a great question. I think it would be really hard to have a conversation about network states if DAOs weren't already somewhat commonplace and blockchains didn't exist. Because like what the blockchain itself represents is a couple things, right? You have the settlement layer for something like Ethereum. You have the contracting layer that allows you to create these sort of agreements and rules-based organizations and encode that on the blockchain. And the benefit of the blockchain there is obviously, transparency It's easier to build trust with the other members of the organization when somebody can't necessarily unilaterally go and change the rules, or there's less like jurisdictional risk where like the legal enforcement arm of some country that you try to contract on top of like doesn't honor what the DAO's the organization was supposed to do. And then there's the monetary aspect as well, which allows you to be able to raise money, spend money, do public goods funding for your DAO or eventually network state without necessarily needing like a country's fiat involved or to go through the traditional banking system. So it provides, sometimes when I talk about DAOs, I say it's like a group chat with a bank account, right? And it's makes it meant to explain that like, like getting a bank account for your group chat is like actually this like onerous, difficult process. Everyone would look at you like you're crazy, but like making a DAO for your group chat is like really easy and like does all the same things, except digitally, right? And then for DAOs themselves, I think, in terms of being able to facilitate democratic processes, voting, delegation, you could have, different governance systems. And then that's a critical part of, I think, any network state. And then I think the like public goods funding models are also important, because how does a network state, actually advance its interests, right? It has to have some decision making on what it should be financing and how it spends the money and who gets to spend it. And all of those things are basically explored by DAOs first in the context of like usually local operations, like things like Molok DAO is, it was a bunch of people in a bunch of different countries, but still, you could fit everybody in the same room. So it starts with that, and then I think it scales up.
Yeah, I think what is interesting, like to me, there's a little bit of like there's a feeling of that as that the technology has progressed in a way to where now we can think about like almost like geopolitical implications of the technology and like a lot of big what ifs that seem like are not too far away around when it comes to new forms of governance and like planting, I don't know, you could say like new forms of sovereignty. But what is interesting to me, at least, like, and then what was like, I've mentioned this a few times, but like Balaji he talks about DAOs twice, like in the entire book. So that's what's like really, really crazy. Like one of the biggest mismatches to me is like, wow, we have all this stuff for incredible governance and like DAOs are really interesting. And like when I thought network state was like, oh, he's going to talk about DAOs a lot. And I was like, he's not. I was really surprised.
Yeah, that was odd for me too. That seems like the community and like the movement on which he's drawing the most in terms of ideology and actual technology. Right.
It's almost, yeah. For me, maybe it's a bit extreme, but it feels like a co-optation of like the movement of the people that are more interested in DAOs and crypto. And he's just kind of like, I don't know, creating this meme for people to like fall into because they're not going to read the book.
Maybe something like that. Yeah. He does talk about Bitcoin a lot, right?
He does.
I would argue that like Bitcoin is the most successful DAO.
Sure. Yeah. Not my preferred type of DAO, but yeah.
Yeah.
But so let's say that we have like the cryptocurrency, whatever it is, native or token based, that can be like the basic infrastructure for like currency of a network state, which obviously a network state ideally will not depend on the monetary issuance of another state. And then we have, if we like DAOs for some kind of collective management of resources. So all of a sudden you have a bank account, you can put asset-backed token, whatever you want into this thing. We have some governance structures in order to potentially engage in collective action. And so what is missing? Like, so in that case, we could just claim, well, actually any DAO is a network state, right? So what is missing in order to actually state change and bring a DAO to the qualification of a network state?
I feel like I kind of want to turn this around on you and ask you, like, what do you think the difference is between like a nation and a state?
We've been spent the last 10 days talking about that. Very easy question. I mean, basically, the nation is the people. The nation is the cultural, ethnical, institutional fabric, like the social fabric that makes a particular group of people identify themselves as being part of a collective and having a shared identity because of these cultural traits that they have in common, and this kind of like latent sense of tribalism, of like we are part of the same tribe. So that's the nation is a very institutional creature. The state is a very institutional creature, which is essentially the way in which this particular group of people decides to institutionalize a particular framework in order to be able to coordinate. Right? So any group of people that qualify as a nation can create an institutional scaffolding. The explicit definition of the state, according to the Montevideo Convention, is that you need like a defined territory, which is the highly controversial element in our view. You need a stable population. You need a government, a way to govern yourself, and then you need some kind of ability to enter into relationship with other states, which implies diplomatic recognition. So when you have those 5 things, and then the stable population can be a nation, but doesn't have to be, right? You can have nations that span across multiple states, and you can have states that combine multiple nations within them. So there is not like, when we talk about nation state, it's a very specific category that assume that there is one nation and one state that are imbricated with one another, but oftentimes this is actually not the case.
Right. So like an example of this would be like the Greek city-state system, where, you know, all of the city-states are sort of part of the Greek nation, but they're organized at the city level as states. And sometimes the states actually decide to coordinate together in order to advance their common goals or defend against, you know, mutual like threats, external threats.
I think even I know we were having conversation with Odysseus, the Greek guy who was in our workshops, and he was saying that that the Greek national identity is actually quite new. That there was this process of the national story, which I mean, of course, heavily took from like the history of ancient Greece, but like people at the time would identify themselves as Athenian or Spartan or whatever, and they would see each other as enemies. And it was only, you know, in like the 1800s, I believe, that like Greece really created a more of a national identity to rally around, and the creation of like the Greek state.
But so to bring back the question to you, so I think it's really difficult to claim that any community that coalesce around a DAO will qualify as a nation. I will say that most of those communities don't even feel the smallest tribalistic affinity or kinship amongst each other. They're just like playing a particular token game. So I think, first of all, there's the question of to which extent, when does the community that is using a DAO to coordinate qualify or not qualify as a nation? And the other question will be, to which extent is the institutional scaffolding or the technological infrastructure of a DAO enough by itself to actually be regarded as a sufficient governmental structure that could therefore potentially qualify as a state, or at least as a network state, if we don't care about the territory.
Yeah, so I think like if you squint, you can kind of think about Bitcoin as a kind of nation. You could think of like Ethereum as a kind of nation. You know, I'm sure there's a bunch of nerds here in Zuzalu who believe that more strongly in their like identity, you know, Ethereum nationalism than maybe they're even, you know, like whatever actual country they're from nationalism, and want to advance the cultural identity of Ethereum more than like whatever country. And I think, you know, like you said, they don't need a central coordinated state to do that necessarily. They can advance the nationhood by recruiting people and advancing the culture. It's like winning the culture war in cultural victory in Civilization or something.
And you also play Civ.
Yeah,
Love that
sure.
game.
So one of the things that I thought was, missing from Balaji's book, The Network State, was talking about how to actually like defend itself, right? And one of the, when I think about states, sometimes, in non-euphemistic terms, like I think of something like an assassination guild with like a public goods department, because it's like the most important reason to have a state is for, I think, security purposes. Like if you don't have a state, it's fine until somebody else with a state comes knocking, and then you're like, wait, I need a state now to be able to self-police, and defend us. And now we need these institutions, and so now we need to think more critically about this and try to build these up. And that part wasn't really there, and I think that the tools basically exist to try to build up like mutual cooperation around mutual defense. So like, hypothetically speaking, I could imagine a thing like a mutual defense DAO, right? Where it's like similar to something like NATO, in the sense that NATO is a way of, coordinating states, nation states, into a sort of super state that can then, have
It could do what the United States wants it to do.
yeah, it is, advance the interests of the member states and like help defend them. But like, what's the peer-to-peer version of that look like? Right? Why can't I have one of those with my friends? And that's an interesting question, because you kind of could. And like, what one idea would be, okay, we form a little DAO, and the rules of the DAO are like you place a bond into the DAO, and the game is, if somebody else in the DAO is attacked, then you pledge to come to their aid and retaliate against whoever attacked them, right? And then the other, there's some oracle that says, well, was somebody attacked? And there's some other oracle that's like, did you come to their aid? And these can be like governance processes. You could incorporate like external oracles or judiciaries. But then if somebody doesn't retaliate, then they have their stake slashed and, redistributed to potentially the other members, and maybe they get kicked out, right? And the game theory of this becomes like, well, you want to vet the members so that you don't inherit somebody's beef, because you don't want to get dragged into conflicts that you don't want to be a part of. And then you want to, if somebody is like particularly aggressive to other people, then they're more likely to get attacked. So you might charge them like a risk premium. And then the way you could scale this up is you have like your, neighborhood mutual defense DAO could vote to be an individual member of the, one level up mutual defense DAO for like the town, which votes to be, parts of the city, which votes to be part of the region, which votes to be part of the, country, which votes to eventually be NATO. And that, and that, I think that's actually how like sort of the world works today. And so we're just re-implementing this on a more transparent, more digital substrate in order to make it work potentially across geographies, right? The whole point of the network state is that, it's not necessarily geographically contiguous, right? You have a bunch of different city states. And so the question that stood out to me was like, what happens if a city state, or, one of the nodes of your network state is somehow threatened or attacked? Right. Like, how does the rest of the network state help? Right? And without answering that question, I think it's kind of hard to know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think there is this that's a big thing that's missing. I think Balaji has this bit of a naive idea that now we can finally make states without violence by buying the land within a nation state, and they'll just like let us create our own state within that.
That just sounds like outsourcing the violence to the people who are already professional at it.
Right. So it's just like, okay, either, I mean, he doesn't talk about it at all. Like, okay, well, if you get into that position, actually, then you just need like a private army, probably, like if which is plenty of problems with that.
That's the state part.
Yeah. But so do we want to go into mafias?
we can go into the organizational structure, but maybe before that, I was wondering, like, to me, like, so again, let's make a distinction between the Balaji's particular definition of network state, which eventually step 7 require acquiring diplomatic recognition, meaning becoming sovereign on your own territory, meaning that you have a territory to defend now, and the broader concept of a network state, which might not imply actually acquiring sovereignty over a territory. In this case, you're not really free riding on the national security of a country. You're actually part of that country still, and you just have individuals coordinating themselves at a transnational level in order to achieve things that are outside of the territorial domain. Right, and I think there is a lot of things that nations or digital nations can do in order to mutualize resources and support one another independently of the land section. And in this case, while I do agree that Balaji is clearly not, given his definition of network state, is clearly not tackling the question of national security and defense, I will argue that in the more general definition of network state, which doesn't have a territorial aspect to it, this question becomes much less crucial.
I think that's a good point, because some of the threats that we face aren't necessarily like even territorial threats. Like in the digital age, right, getting like hacked can be, like pretty bad. You can lose all your ether, all your money. And so forming a network state that just provides like network defense and helps provide OPSEC and like is some place you go to like report on things as they happen, and helps try to identify people who might attack you just digitally, is also a useful thing that doesn't require you to like take on the challenge of like physical defense out the gate as a network state, but it could allow your network state to specialize in a certain other, realm of protection and coordination.
And I think once we remove the question of like actual physical defense, I think an interesting thing that also we have been exploring a little bit in during the workshop here at Zuzalu is like, especially in a capitalistic world, perhaps the best way of actually doing any type of enforcement is not violence and physical violence, but it's like economic sanctions. And today, nation states are doing that, but nothing prevents a network state, which has some kind of economic power, to actually engage into sanctioning those entities that do not abide by specific principles.
Yeah, I agree with that. And another form of defense is like legal defense, right? So being able to, for example, pool money and spend it to protect individual members that might be subject to like frivolous litigation is yet another way that a network state would be valuable. And maybe DAOs are ahead of the curve in this, because Molok DAO, thank you to all of the donors, was actually helping pay the like PepperSec, the Tornado Cash team's legal bills, right? One of the Tornado Cash devs was, arrested and thrown in jail in the Netherlands for the last 6 months, Alexei Pertsov. So right. Molok DAO was contributing to the legal defense fund for that.
Do you want to talk about maybe a bit on your work on privacy pools? I think that's an interesting part of this question of like, I guess, asserting sovereignty in some ways that are, I guess, in some instances, antagonistic towards certain states.
Yeah, I think maybe in the same way that like ownership of guns is protected under the Second Amendment, like ownership of like anonymous money should be protected under the Second Amendment in America. But I think privacy becomes like really important for public blockchains, because everything is by default public, right? Anybody sees all your transactions. And the way that we had privacy before Tornado Cash existed was it was like run your money through Coinbase. That's like not a very sophisticated privacy scheme.
Run your money through the private corporation.
Yeah, and like low-level support engineers at Coinbase can be like bribed to reveal like, your entire transaction history, and that's not what anybody wants. And so, and I don't know, for the benefit of the listeners, Tornado Cash itself was sanctioned in August of last year, and that's when they put Alexei in jail. And since then, Americans have not had access to privacy on the blockchain, right? Maybe there's a couple other tools, that can help out, but that was one of the best ones. And we didn't make it because we didn't anticipate like it being geopolitically important. We wanted privacy for ourselves and our friends, like just for that. And so in the aftermath of Tornado getting sanctioned and us trying to figure out how we might be able to still have privacy in a way that works within the framework of the existing sort of government sanctions regimes, we decided to make privacy pools. And so privacy pools has one additional feature. We say we fixed it, Tornado Cash, because Tornado Cash had the problem where when you withdraw, you're still like contributing to the anonymity set of all of the other potentially illicit sources of funds, and you can't necessarily help the regulators isolate the illicit funds. Whereas in privacy pools, the additional feature it has is that when you withdraw, you can actually go and specify the deposits that you don't want to be associated with, and you can remove them from your own anonymity set, which also removes you from their anonymity set. And so it's a ZK Merkle proof of exclusion, fancy cryptography, but ultimately it allows you to prove verifiably by anybody that you are not associated with certain deposits that you could, you probably know are illicit. Like we know, a lot of the hacks, where the money goes and which specific deposits there are, but most importantly, without revealing who specifically you are.
So then is this like almost like a personal, you can choose your own personal sanctions list?
Yes, but if you're, for example, an American, it would behoove you to choose the American sanctions list.
Right, but like you can, if it's already public, like which addresses are probably associated with North Korea or whatever, so that because like then that's like the whole issue with the OFAC thing, is that like your funds are getting mixed with North Korea's, and they're a bad actor. So if there's already a public list of like addresses that are associated, you can just be like, I don't want to associate my funds with this list, and therefore you've proven while still maintaining your privacy.
Yeah, that's right.
And then just for the listener as well, in case like the way that Tornado Cash and privacy pools, I assume as well, works as well, is everyone puts in like the same amount of ETH, and then gets mixed, and then
you deposit
withdrawn
1, 10, or 100 ETH, and then sometime later you withdraw the amount you put in. And, all that anybody can tell from the blockchain is that somebody withdrew from the pool. They don't know which of the deposits it is,
right. It's hard to match one to one who deposited it and what their outside address is.
Right. Yeah, we're making some advances on the privacy pool stuff. I'm actually excited to report that the, person who wrote the privacy, the Tornado Cash paper on behalf of the St. Louis Federal Reserve is this guy named Fabian Schar. He's a blockchain professor at University of Basel. And the Europeans think a little bit differently about privacy than the Americans, because the Europeans value it a little more highly. The Americans kind of want to spy on everybody. So he was, discussed it with him, and he was open to exploring how privacy pools could be a useful standard across the industry. In his paper, it was one of the, about Tornado Cash from the St. Louis Federal Reserve, which was shocking to me. They wrote the line, Tornado Cash could be an integral part of public blockchain infrastructure. And I was like mind blown, right? At this, somebody put this, and they made the recommendation for the regulations to be, we'll let you use this. However, you have to reveal, you have to use this. So the Tornado Cash devs actually built a compliance tool that allows you to, provide receipts to some regulated financial institution that helps them actually connect your withdrawal to your deposit. And so it reveals your whole, transaction history to them. And so they said, look, if you're willing to reveal your transaction history to a regulated financial institution, we're willing to let you use this thing and, maintain your privacy to everybody else, right? That's the benefit for you. The annoying part of that is that you end up sort of in the same place as like then low-level support engineers at Coinbase being able to, connect the dots and have your whole transaction history. And so the reason for making privacy pools is because we believe that we can do better than that. We believe that, I should be able to, use the privacy pools, maintain my privacy, and simply prove that I'm not the illicit actors, the sources of the bad funds, because we think that that's what the law requires. I don't think the law actually requires that you reveal your whole transaction history in order to maintain privacy. And this does do what the regulators want, which is it helps them isolate the illicit funds because it reduces their anonymity set.
Do we now want to get into blockchain mafias? Because you posted a meme, I think, last night based on maybe conversations that we're having at dinner.
Yeah.
What was it, like nation states, network states,
blockchain religions,
decentralized mafias.
Yeah.
So do we want to talk about that? I think maybe Primavera, you can talk a bit about the interesting aspects of that.
Yeah, I mean, we had this little discussion yesterday evening, and in some way, it's like there's something interesting because when we talk about network state outside of Balaji's definition of a territorial network state, but rather those things that kind of coexist alongside existing territory that are controlled by nation states, we have an actual interesting example in many countries where there is this kind of alternative governmental structure, which is potentially operating as an alternative type of state, which is the mafia, and doesn't at all claim ownership or sovereignty over the territory, but rather, and in this case, potentially free ride, but not just free ride, because it's also providing its own services. And so we were reflecting on, like, would a network state that actually doesn't want to reclaim any type of sovereignty over a particular piece of land, will that end up looking something potentially like the mafia, also taking into account that the mafia obviously has its own specific agenda, but the infrastructure and the interweaving, and in fact the potential form of interaction, collaboration, or competition that exists between the mafia and the governments, we could potentially see a similar pattern if we really had those network states that do not try to separate themselves from the state, but because they have their own governance structure, because they have their own mechanism of funding and potentially even defense, etc., but that coexist exactly on the same piece of land. And so you have all of a sudden two types of governments that needs to somehow find their protocol and their interfaces. And so we were discussing this question of, like, how would a network state look like, and would the mafia be one of those particular instances or recipe that a network state could have? And can we think of this particular infrastructure in a way that is not necessarily only negative, but for instance, can we imagine a network state that cares about the environment and that intertwine with the territory and with the government in order to try and actually advocate for specific behavior and even like influence the national government to act in a particular way in order to promote the interest of the environmental network state, i.e. the environmental mafia.
Eco-terror DAO, eco-terror network states.
Yeah.
We really need to watch How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and then we can talk about it more.
Right. This is a great question, and it's a little bit, awkward, right? Because we're not trying to build tools for mafias. Yeah, we're trying to, advance sovereignty for individuals and for groups. But as it turns out, the awkward conclusion, that you come to after learning about this kind of stuff for a bit is that mafias are the groups of people that take sovereignty the most seriously out of everybody else, right? It's like the opening scene of The Godfather. guy asks him for a favor because his daughter was, I think, like raped or harassed, and then he sends his guys to teach the kid a lesson, right? And so that is a governance system and some deterrence being acted out in a way that enhances the sovereignty of the people involved, because it makes other people less likely to infringe on their rights. I think it was like Rune. He's like some Twitter personality. He said that like until the tools are like used by the Sinaloa cartel, like they should be the most likely to set the stuff up. And it's like, I don't really want to be building tools for the Sinaloa cartel, but like I don't know. It's something to think about. And maybe you're right. Like maybe what we need is more positive examples of this stuff used for public goods, and ways of people coordinate, advance their sovereignty, but then align that coordination with, environmental causes or, human rights. And then we maybe see that the nation state is not the vehicle for doing those things as effectively. And so we start to explore these alternatives.
Yeah, and I think that if we remove the word mafia, which obviously has its own connotation, but I think there is something interesting in actually looking at how there can be alternative organizations that really organize at an international, transnational layer, and we do have those, right? We have like Extinction Rebellion, etc. But oftentimes they have a very antagonistic or contrast, like rebellious type of approach. What is interesting when we look at the way in which the mafia organize is that there is actually, while it is antagonistic, it's actually deeply entwined, entrenched within the existing infrastructure of the national government, and therefore has influence, right? And I think a network state that could potentially acquire some type of diplomatic recognition independently of the territory and become therefore an actor in international relationship, because it actually connect and interface also with national governments, could actually have quite an impact, perhaps more than the lobbyist group that are lobbying for something, because there is both economic capacity because of like decentralized sanction and whatever, but also subsidizing, right? And all of a sudden you could have a network state that is subsidizing a nation state to act in a particular manner, and that is entering into also the politics of this thing because it acts itself as a political actor.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to like think about the Balaji network state as like owning territory itself. That's like not really what it seems like how mafias operate. They seem to operate more along the lines of a network state that doesn't have territory, but like you said, just engages with the existing political structures that are there, and so and a lot of it's secrecy, right? As soon as you have a plot of land, like everybody knows who you are and where you are. And it's almost like if you do that, you have to then be able to defend that plot of land. And it's a little bit harder than if you simply were just operating, within the same geography as everybody else, and nobody like could easily identify your headquarters, right?
Well, I think maybe mafias in particular, they have, which we talked a lot about in our sort of public presentations, that they have an interface with the market and the state that works quite well. And they're not trying to necessarily separate themselves from it, but like use it in ways to advance its own goals.
Yeah, exactly. And I think again, like the thing with the mafia is that they try to act in a underground, concealed manner, and like probably engaging in some illicit activities. If we had an actual transparency system, because there is nothing to hide, quite to the contrary, and because the network state wants to have some kind of political power act as a political actor without having to like work in the back scene, then we could have a system that is much more legitimate by the way in which it actually operates, and therefore could have like the proper type of accountability and legitimacy while nonetheless engaging into these same type of interfaces together with the state.
We probably underestimate the degree to which like either, you know, banker mafias or even like military industrial complex mafias have already infiltrated the state and use it to their own advantage in order to like make profit and
Of course,
advance their own interests. And like like in a certain light, you know, if the mafias come to control the state, then like maybe the state isn't much better than the mafia to begin with.
Well, I think there's a lot of a lot of things to consider about that. But any other directions that you want to go with the conversation? Give us your hottest take, the spiciest take you can think of to close it off.
I'll just say that I hope that the Iranian diaspora is able to, you know, form some sort of network state or use the tools of network states to advance the cause of human rights in Iran. I think that would be a positive development.